Holder is the author of the book, The Cure for Hate, and is an international leader focused on educating individuals, families, communities, law enforcement, and governance that are working with white supremacist movements. Tony co-founded the not-for-profit Life After Hate, an organization that helps people leave white supremacist movements behind, drawing on his journey leaving a hate-based organization. In his youth and early childhood, Tony was the leader of one of the largest Canadian neo-Nazi skinhead organizations, the Aryan Resistance Movement, and an organizer for the White Aryan Resistance in Aryan Nations, and an articulate Holocaust denier. Today, his experience as an expert in de-radicalization is shaped by over 1,000 hours of individual and group counseling, giving him a deep understanding of how people are drawn into these movements and how to reconnect them with their humanity and society at large. He's featured in the documentary called Healing from Hate, which Karuna actually showed as part of a series we had a few years ago. And he's most recently released a new film called Cure for Hate, Bearing Witness to Auschwitz, which is just now being launched and distributed to schools. He's worked closely with law enforcement and governments in helping the U.S. and others deal with the rising problem of white supremacist organizations. And Robert Orell, a Swedish citizen, as I've said, who's just joining us from Sweden, has more than 2 decades experience in the field of preventing violent extremism, working on the disengagement, rehabilitation, and reintegration of violent extremists in Europe and in the U.S. He got involved with the Swedish White Power movement in his early teens, but after working with the organization Exit Sweden, which helped him leave neo-Nazism behind, he then became director of that organization and helped hundreds of people separate from white supremacist gangs. Currently, he's a senior international expert focused on training and capacity building and setting up exit programs, and co-teaches a course on the psychology of violence and hate. So, as evidenced from the depth and breadth of experience, we have got quite a panel. So before we dive in, I think we should have a round of applause. It is a pretty amazing group of people. So what I thought we would do, and this is the idea, is this is a discussion, and we are going to save time for questions at the end. So please, if you have questions, keep them in mind, and we're gonna leave time at the end. So I thought we would start with asking each of you to tell a story of how you became involved in the interventions to stop the spread of hate. So where did it begin for you? What can you tell us about your work on why people become engaged or then disengage with hate and violent extremism? So just starting, with your personal story. So maybe, Loretta, should we start with you?
If you insist.
Yep.
My first experience in hate violence happened when I was 10 years old, but I didn't know what it was at the time. My father, my mother, and 3 of the 8 kids, we were moving from Virginia to Texas after Dad retired from the Army. And my dad stopped at a gas station to fill up the car, and back then you had attendants that pumped the gas, and he went to the bathroom while the guy was filling the car. And as he came out of the bathroom, the attendant said, "You used the wrong bathroom, you used the wrong bathroom." And my dad looked up, he said, "I used the men's room, what's the problem?" It turned out he didn't go around the back and use the colored bathroom, and this was 1963. And so my dad and the guy got into a little argument. My dad threw the money at him, and then we took off. About 5 miles down the road, this car of what I now know as teenagers, but to a teen-year-old, they look like grown men, came and fired a shot at our car. And Mom started screaming, all the kids started screaming. Dad pulled off to the side of the road and calmly went to the trunk of the car and got out his gun because he was a weapons specialist after 26 years in the Army, and someone had just fired at his family. So when these kids came back up the road, Dad carefully fired a shot over their heads, but he could have killed all of them, right? And Mom was screaming, we were screaming, and all Dad said, "Y'all need to shut up," because he was so angry at what had happened. That was my first and last time in Mississippi till I got back there, 40 years later, because of hate crimes taking place against Camp Sister Spirit, which was a lesbian camp, and all kinds of hate crimes were happening against them. Dead dogs in their mailbox, paint strewn over the camp and stuff. And someone from Congress, Barney Frank, I think it was, had a hearing on hate crimes down in Mississippi for us to investigate what happened to Camp Sister Spirit. And so that was for work, but I just told a personal story for how, one has to experience hate violence to even know what it is. And at the time, my family didn't tell me what was going on. I mean, they thought if they kept us racially ignorant, that was the way to protect us. But it wasn't, because I was deathly afraid of Mississippi until I had to go back there 40 years later, or however many years later than that was. And so that was my introduction. And in 1990, I got hired by Reverend C.T. Vivian to work at formerly the National Anti-Klan Network, the Center for Democratic Renewal. And so then, instead of just experiencing racism, I got to study it and work against it. My first job was as program director, and so I had to help communities that experience hate recover, or deal with the Klan marching through their town, or neo-Nazis coming, or a burning of a cross, or a hate crime, or whatever. That was my first job with them. But then we started accepting people pleas for help when they wanted to leave hate movements like Tony has done. And so 2 years into the job, Reverend Vivian came to me and said, Loretta, we need you to assist us in what they call deprogramming white supremacists. And I told him, no, because I basically, and Reverend Vivian very famously said, he said, if you ask people to give up hate, then you need to be there for them when they do. And I went, oh, shit. But I couldn't curse in front of a preacher, so I just sucked it in and then started talking to people leaving hate groups. I wasn't the first person they talked to. That was our research director, but I was the person whose job it was to help them reintegrate and renormalize their lives. And so then I learned that once I got to know them, I couldn't hate them anymore. So then I had to find another source for my activism, because hate was a great fuel. You could always, you never ran out of anger and hate kind of things. And so let me just shut up and say, I thought I could change them, and I think they changed me more.
Powerful.
Tony?
Well, I grew up in an affluent middle-class neighborhood in Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada, right? But believe it or not, Canada has just as many hate groups per capita as the United States. And one of the myths people have is that it's low economic status families and broken homes where people come from. But I came from a house where my father was a psychiatrist, and I went to private school. And and I think of who I was at the age of 4 or 5. Who was little Tony? And I was this bright, curious, mischievous, stubborn, sensitive, open to the world little guy. And life happens to us, and we learn that it's not safe to necessarily be those things. It's not safe to be sensitive or open. And as we go along, we put on masks to be someone else in order to feel loved, or we put on armor in order to feel safe. And I worship the ground my dad walked on. He was a great provider, but being a workaholic, I never saw him. And the things that I crave most from him is time and attention, and his approval I could never get. And one night when I was 9 years old, I walked in on him with another woman, and just like that, bang, the God fell off the pedestal. I don't know if anybody remembers that time when your parents go from being infallible gods to all too human. And my grades at school went from an A and a B down to a C and a D by the next year. And I went to an all-boys Catholic school with Christian brothers who were a pretty sadistic bunch. And with my parents' consent, if I didn't get an A or a B on major tests and assignments, I was marched down to the hall and hit on the rear end with a yardstick. The first time it was 2, then it was 4, then it was 6, then it was 8. And it was in that office over and over and over again that I was really introduced to shame and powerlessness. And I was really angry at all the authority figures in my life. You know, when I'd walked in with my father, I felt I don't know why, I felt guilty, I felt shame, I felt a whole range of emotions. And I went from listening to Elton John and Queen to The Clash and the Sex Pistols, and I got into the punk scene because that's where my energy was at. That's where I vibed with the anger, and it was also a place where people who didn't fit in. And that's where I found community and connection. And I just want to be very clear here. I don't blame anything that I did on my childhood. Everything I did, I chose to do, and I have to accept responsibility for that. But I share you things from my childhood so you understand the lens through which I made those choices. And it was through the punk scene that I came across skinheads for the first time. And they terrified me. But at the same time, I was drawn to them because I was a soft kid. I was a sensitive kid growing up. I was like a nerdy kid. And they had the one thing that I didn't have, and that was toughness. And so I met these skinheads, and the first time I met them, I was standing outside the first punk concert I ever went to was Black Flag with Henry Rollins. And I'm wearing Doc Martens. I'd just come back from boarding school in England. I went to 3 high schools in 4 years. And I'm wearing my Doc Martens, and these guys come up and look at, like, what size feet you have. And I'm terrified because they're going to rob me if I tell them if my shoe size matches theirs. And I lied and said my feet, no, 7.5. And, you know, they went in. Those guys became my friends, my best friends. And I felt safe when I was with them. That's what drew me to them. And in order for me to have their protection, I had to have their respect. In order to have their respect, I had to commit all the same acts of violence that they did. And coming from that place of powerlessness, being on the doling out end of violence, when I was with them and people were afraid of me for the first time, not because of me, because I was with them, that made me feel really powerful. And the adrenaline rush with the violence, I'm going to be honest, it was intoxicating. And I was a smart kid, so I was a big fish intellectually in a very small pond. And I became the sort of leader and ideologically drove it. And the more I drove things to the extremes, the more notoriety I generated, the more fear I generated, the more powerful I felt. And somebody asked me, like, Tony, you seem like such a nice guy. How did you lose your humanity? And I said, I didn't lose it. I traded it for acceptance and approval until there was nothing left. What I got from being in those movements was I got power when I felt powerless. I got attention when I felt invisible. And I got acceptance when I felt unlovable. And those are the vulnerabilities that draw people in to those movements. And I'll share with you a little later on about factors and what helped me to get out, but that was how I got in, and I rose quite high up the ranks with Aryan Nations and White Aryan Resistance and all of that, and spent 15 years in those movements.
Thank you.
All right, so I'm born and raised in Stockholm, Sweden, over in Europe. You cannot hear? I'll speak up a bit better. All right, thanks for that note. So I'm born and raised and grew up in Stockholm, Sweden, over in Europe. And the way I ended up in this type of involvement, I think had a few different things in life that affected this. Primarily school and the experiences in the social dynamics that happen there. So when I'm age 12, in Swedish, this would be 11, this would be a school grade 5, so 5th grade. The school is going to be renovated, so we move into another school. And imagine 300 pupils, students, crowded and sharing the space with another 400 students. Obviously, there will be conflicts or such. And my impression is that the teachers or the adults just simply wasn't there. There was really nobody who identified this, who approached this in a way. And I managed to get in trouble with one of the groups from the school where we moved into. This was a group of probably 20, 25 young males who were living in a suburb of Stockholm. And at that point, this is mid-1990s, there's an integration project in Stockholm. I only learned this 20 years later when I talked with a teacher who actually worked in Stockholm at that point. And this integration project was to take suburb students and put them in inner city school to have integration. I think the problem is that it also has to be worked with. My experience is that it was very segregated in the school. There wasn't really any interaction between us different students. And I managed to get in conflict with this group, which escalated over the year. I was alone in conflict with this group of 20, 25 students. And teachers weren't really around or acknowledging this, even to the extent that they came to our classroom while we were having class, opened the door and said that they needed to talk to me. And the teacher's like, no, we're having class. Come back later. And that's the level how they kind of acknowledged the conflict. So this created a lot of uncertainty, a lot of fear. Parallelly, academically, it's not a really good year. And I'm told that I have to redo 5th grade. And to redo a year is extremely shameful. It's shameful to not accomplish what everybody else accomplished, to be a failure, to be a loser. I decided to change school at this point. I couldn't go and come back after the summer and see my friends in the eye and see that they're progressing and I'm still in the same grade. So I changed school, and I think for me this was a big change in both motivations to participate in school, but also to build an alternative identity. When I came to the new school, the first day, my new classmates wondered if I was an intern from 9th grade, because I was a head higher than them. I was a bit bigger. I grew a lot. So I think that the identification and feeling of belonging just wasn't really there from the beginning. I decided to develop an alternative identity. I started listening to very dark death metal and black metal music. I painted upside-down crosses on my jacket, and I took on a lifestyle, a subcultural lifestyle, to kind of show that I was different and to I think, kind of gain my space. From there, I met some elderly friends and joined to a football game, and in Europe we have this, I think, a little bit of a different type of supporter culture, which focuses a lot on drinking and fighting and what we would call football hooligans. So I got introduced to that lifestyle, which was, I think, I mean, it was arousing to be in that type of environments where there was all this tension of potential violence and fight, and as somebody who was young and very angry, very frustrated, it was a perfect outlet to have my emotions and my rage channeled. And while I was in this movement, I got introduced to the white supremacy ideology. And I think there was a shift between the two former subcultures and this particular ideology, where the two former kind of channeled hate and frustration, but the later really kind of provided me with a sense of not just being good enough, but being superior. And that emotion was, I mean, it was difficult to withstand at that point. I had a self-esteem that was very low, a school failure, and all of a sudden, there's this group or movement that provides me with a sense of superiority. So very uncritically, I devoted myself to this movement and this cause. At age 15, I I receive glasses, meaning that for 9 years I went to school needing glasses without having them. And to receive this after 9 years of failure was quite bitter. It was quite bitter to realize that a pair of glasses was needed to avoid this type of frustration and failure and shame. So I think that only fueled my anger and my frustration and my devotion to the movement, because the movement, the white supremacy movement, pointed at society as the fault of all our problems. All the conspiracy theories pointed at that society wanted young white males to fail. And here I was with this experience and this explanation to why this had happened to me. So I went into this movement for several years, as I said, very uncritically, swallowing all of the ideology and all the ideas, because they gave me a sense of purpose, meaning, belonging, and some type of self-esteem. Yeah, I think that's my way into this type of work.
Thank you all for very personal, moving stories. I mean, there's so many directions we can go, and it's hard to know. Oh, sorry. Of where to go. The one thing I wanted to get to was sort of understanding the landscape here in the U.S. and in Europe, where you've done a lot of work of supremacist, violent supremacist groups. But I'm just, before we do that, I would like to hear, and then all of you to speak to that, but to Loretta, to the point of your work of helping communities heal. I mean, we're going to talk more about different ways of helping individuals in the work you do, but I'm curious if you could just say a little bit more about that work. So you went in after there had been some terrible racist incident, of what that work looked like.
Yes, our executive director at the time was Daniel Levitas, and our research director was Lenny Zeskin, and we wrote a book called When Hate Groups Come to Town that's still available, I believe, and it was about demonstrating that communities who suffered from hate violence or the presence of Klansmen, neo-Nazis, whatever, actually had things they could do, because when I arrived at the town to work with them, quite often the people of color in the town would kind of like stand back and see what the white folks were going to do, because they were tired of being on the front line and the targets of the attack and violence. And the white people would separate into 3 basic camps. The largest camp would be the ones that say, let's just ignore it, it'll go away. If we bring attention to it, it'll damage the reputation of our town. We don't want that, so they would board up the windows and then go silent. The second group would be the people who wanted to fight back, punch a Nazi. Usually they were called Anti-Racist Action, the group name that they used. And this was a very masculinist response to hate groups. If they were gonna wear red shoes on their red shoelaces, we were gonna wear the white ones, and on and on and on, right? And so they wanted to physically confront the members of the hate group if they were coming to march or whatever. The optics were always bad on that, because it'd be like 10 Klansmen and 200 anti-Klan protesters. And so it always provided a narrative where the members of the hate groups could portray themselves as victims when they got attacked by the larger set of the anti-racist action folks. But the third set of the white folks were the ones I was most interested in. And these were the people who wanted to do something, knew violence wasn't the answer, nor ignoring it is the answer, but they didn't know what to do. And these were the people for whom I developed the concept of appropriate whiteness, because they did not have any memory, any experience in holding a white identity and fighting white supremacy at the same time. Instead, they were made to feel guilty about being white, which of course the hate groups profited from. Right now, we got this whole thing about it's okay to be white. And so they would be filled with a lot of fear and paralysis and outrage because they didn't want it happening, but they didn't want to stand aside, nor did, that kind of thing. And so it was very patient work with this third group of people to come up with effective strategies that they could employ to signal that these people don't represent us. This is what a town does when it stands up against hate. Matter of fact, one town we worked with, there was a big attack on, a rock was thrown through a family's window because they had a menorah in the window. And a whole film came out of that called Not in My Town, because the town came back and responded in solidarity. So the whole town put up menorahs in their windows to show solidarity and stuff. And I think HBO showed that film eventually. And so showing people different things that they could do positively and to kind of send out the signal that the hate groups were not welcome there was a joy. It really became a pleasure to watch people's fear turn into determination, to not let these hate groups represent them, and to not, buy into, that silence is the best we can do kind of narrative. So it was quite fun and exciting work. I enjoyed it. I kind of called myself the white girl whisperer because of it.
That's really interesting. So we're going to talk more in a little bit about getting people out, getting communities out to disengage. But if we could talk a little bit now, just broadly, from your different perspectives about the landscape, basically, of groups today in the U.S. and also, as I said, internationally. Of you're working from different perspectives, different experiences. But I would be great to hear from all of you because I think it sort of helps us all sort of get the sense of what's, things have evolved, obviously, a lot in the last 10 years. They've been evolving for 100 years, but it would be great to hear from each of you, your sense of the landscape. So maybe, Tony, start with you.
Sure, and I think as much as they've evolved, they stay the same.
Yeah.
There's the ideas, the philosophy has changed. What's changed hasn't changed. What's changed is technology. And I was involved when the internet first came out and built one of the very first white power websites in the United States for Resistance Records. It was a white power record label that had a whole pile of ideologically driven bands. And I remember at the time, like, my God, this is like the Wild West. This is, I remember a time where I used to stand on street corners handing out leaflets to people, and not the most effective way to recruit people, and very time consuming. But the internet provided, at the time, a sense of anonymity. It provided the ability to reach masses of people with very little cost and effort, and so we were all over that. And when I think about the internet then, the internet is where you would go to get your news. It was one place where you went to go and get information. And what's changed with the internet and social media is it's where you go to search for community. And we get our news from our communities. And it provides a different dynamic around which people organize it. Because with social media, if you think of the AV club at your school might have, 5 or 6 nerdy kids that do the AV club, and you think, well, they're, isolated only in the high school. But you can find a community of 200,000 AV club kids around the country. The ability to connect with and find community in whatever it is you're into is so powerful. And instead of people being isolated and, using a gross generalization here, playing video games in their Call of Duty in their mom's basement, they can now find a community of hundreds of thousands like that. And that holds true with whether you're looking at incels and misogyny or a whole pile of toxic ideologies that are out there. And it's also for good. You can, find church groups and faith and there's all kinds of positive things. The internet doesn't care, right? It's a technology. And, and I think that's become different. And the way groups I see that are organizing now, if you look at groups like Proud Boys, you know, were the leaders, Afro-Cuban fellow, and you know, are they an ideologically white supremacist group? Probably not. Are there white supremacist neo-Nazis in the group? Absolutely. Are they a fascist group? Absolutely. But there's sort of different lines and channels, and it's now being tied into, you know, masculinity, and now it's fight clubs, and there's all these overlapping toxic, really extreme groups like Atomwaffen in the base that are about small cells and terrorist actions. Most of the attacks that are happening in places of worship and other things where there's mass shootings based on racist ideology, they're cells of one, you know, and they often aren't connected to an organized group. And so it's, you know, we're only just beginning to see people that have radicalized online and never had human contact with other people. There's people that are radicalized online, found community, and then they organize offline. But it's only the last couple of years that we've come across research where there's people completely radicalized online without any human contact that are plotting or committing acts of violence. But the ideology is the same. That hasn't changed. It's the technology around it that provides different opportunities to organize.
Yeah, indeed. I think, I mean, looking at as Tony says, the ideology itself is probably not changed too much over the last 30, 40 years, but we really see a changing landscape when it comes to how these groups operate, organize, market themselves. And I know researchers today who talks about the fluidity in terms of ideologies, that there's more synergies with other type of similar conspiracy theories and other type of anti-state, anti-establishment type of movements. But if we come down to look at the white power, the white supremacy type of ideas and developments, they're fairly, I mean, rooted in the ideologies that they've been supporting for a long time. When it comes to the movement, coming from Europe, I think it's really important to acknowledge the transnational nature of today's movement. As Tony said, you can be alone in your chamber and still be connected to thousands of people all over the world. So this is a change we've seen also over the last 20 years, that there's more interconnected relationships and cooperations between EU and US primarily, but also other parts of the world, where these groups get inspired by and they connect with and they cooperate much closer and much more. In Europe, for example, for a long time, the American neo-Nazis in the 80s served as role models for how to form small cell formations and how to prepare for a coming race war. There's numerous of groups and cells that have been inspired by this, and there are neo-Nazi literature that's found at perpetrators' homes or while they're arrested up until this day. So there's an enormous influence between EU and US when it comes to ideology and the spread of it. And I think just to echo what Tony says, looking at the internet and how this has changed the environment and the reach, I think we have to acknowledge this and really also think about constructive responses. So how do we respond to this mass information that's available, this mass recruitment of individuals that's potentially happening? And how do we engage with young people online in a constructive way to divert from this type of groups? I think this might be a conversation itself, but I want to just kind of bring it up here, the importance of working proactively online in online spaces.
No, thank you. And that's just talking about how to respond and react is really what I want to go to next. But Loretta, it would be interesting to hear from you on this subject, who's been working for decades here in the U.S., what your perspective is on the landscape, the dynamics, the challenges of today, Obviously, social media, internet being a huge factor, but it'd be just great to hear your perspective.
Well, I mean, obviously, we have to work on several fronts at the same time. I mean, the Ku Klux Klan did not need the internet. It grew. So you have to work on the ideological front. You have to challenge, anti-blackness, anti-Semitism, misogyny, Christian nationalism. So you've got to challenge the ideas behind. And these ideas are evergreen. They don't just come and go. They're always there. And so you make a mistake not detecting the prevalence of the same set of ideas that have been around for hundreds and hundreds of years. So we've got new toys to play with, but we've got old ideas. There's nothing original about them at all. I also think that one of the problems with challenging hate groups is how we define the nature of the problem. Because a lot of people in some of our leading organizations see them as a criminal problem instead of a social problem. And so they think that the best way to challenge them is to beef up law enforcement response to them, totally ignoring the fact that our law enforcement is riddled with people in hate groups, as the January 6th protests proved. And so that's also one of the challenges is working with law enforcement, but also being skeptical about their involvement in it at the same time. Dealing with the social alienation of vulnerable people who can be recruited, it has to take place within those settings where those young people are. That means their schools, their churches, their community places. And those places are remarkably reluctant to let groups come in there and deal with what they're not dealing with, which is that sense of isolation and alienation. I mean, what Tony said about feeling powerless, and then the minute you join a hate group, then instead of you being afraid, everybody's afraid of you. I heard this story over and over and over again in the members of hate groups that I've talked about. And so why not get there before the problem comes up as opposed to try to address it afterwards? That's something as a society we're failing at miserably. And then the question of the leaderless resistance strategy that has been described, the cellular strategy. I mean, Louis Beam, the Klansman, told him to do it in 1983. I mean, it's well documented, and somehow the FBI can find, a poison grape on a ship, and they can't seem to find all these cellular structures that are hiding in plain sight, and doing a lot of self-incrimination over the internet. How can we monitor stuff that apparently the government can't? Kind of things. Everybody saw January 6th coming, except apparently the government, that kind of thing. And so I still think there's a need to address what they call stochastic violence, the people who encourage others to commit the hate and stuff like that. Make a direct link between that. Someone doesn't get a get out of jail free card for just claiming I was just using my free speech and I'm not responsible for what someone used my speech to justify. And so there's a lot of ways to challenge it. You got to inoculate the people who could be recruited. You certainly got to center victim needs in the process. You can't ignore them. And I'll just shut up. I want to say one thing. But the first challenge I make, and this is what I teach in my classes at Smith, is you have to separate whiteness as an identity from white supremacy as an ideology. Because obviously not all white people are white supremacists, and just as obvious, not all white supremacists are white, like the leader of the Proud Boys. And so if you don't make that kind of basic ideological separation, you'll always be kind of slightly off-center in trying to go directly at the source of the problem, because you're using, very primitive identity politics to address something that is an ideological struggle between fascism and democracy. That's not just based on identity.
So could we shift to kind of to where we were headed, but in the response side of, here we have the Brave Schools program trying to work in a preventive way to help schools identify when you've got kids who look like they might be isolated or marginalized or vulnerable. So how can, it's so many different levels here, obviously, but I think talking a little bit about approaches that you are involved in or you see that you think are successful and have promise, both on the prevention side, and then obviously you do a lot of work on helping those who've gone down that path disengage, which is different. But it would be great to talk about the response side for a minute now. So Tony, you want to go first?
Sure. I think, I believe that the level to which we dehumanize other human beings is a mirror reflection of how internally disconnected and dehumanized we are, right? We're projecting it onto other people. So where does our internal disconnection, dehumanization come from? And I talk a lot about toxic shame, right? I am bad, I am wrong. It's the feeling that we're not good enough, we're less than, we're not pretty enough, we're not smart enough, we're not unlovable, we're powerless, that we're weak. And it sits in our subconscious identity belief system, and we live our lives in reaction to that. So behind every perfectionist is often a person who feels deeply flawed, but is trying to convince the world that they're not, that they're perfectionists. Behind every overachiever, mostly, is someone who's trying to prove to the world that they're superhuman to compensate for the fact that they're less than human. I can think of a former president who has to tell the world always that he's the greatest, the best, the most amazing, fantastic deal maker. And when I heard that he didn't drink and his brother drank and died of a drug overdose, I went, I bet you if I look into that family history, there's an extremely abusive alcoholic parent. And lo and behold, it's right there in plainer day. And those people like that are living their lives in reaction to their toxic shame. And that's where the dehumanization comes from. We either project it onto other people, and I adopted an ideology that told me I was greater than to compensate for my feeling of being less than. We either project it onto other people, and shame, at the root of all violence is shame. Dr. James Gilligan, who wrote a book called Violence, Reflections on a National Epidemic, he was a forensic psychiatrist in California in the federal penitentiary system. And all the time over 20 years that he was there, he said he wasn't aware of a serious act of violence that wasn't rooted in shame and humiliation. He said all violence is an attempt to transform shame into self-esteem. Shame is the dirty secret we hide from ourselves. And whether it's substance abuse, cutting, eating disorders, there's a whole myriad of self-numbing, self-distracting, destructive behaviors in order to numb ourselves and avoid the feeling of shame. Toxic shame is at the root of a whole spectrum of antisocial outcomes. And I think one of the things that we can do as a society is figure out how to go into schools and teach children shame resilience. Just because you have toxic shame doesn't mean you're going to be a white supremacist or you're going to join a gang. But I can almost guarantee you that every person I've met that's joined a gang or became a white supremacist has got toxic shame. If you look at some recent research that was done by the University of Maryland and their studies of terrorism, responses to terrorism, the average population, 15% of the average population has 2 adverse childhood events in their history. When they look at a sample of people that have joined violent extremist groups, right-wing violent extremist groups, 66% had 4 or more. And so if we want to look at what is the root of the dehumanization, we know what the root is, toxic shame. So what's the antidote for toxic shame? How do we deal with that dehumanization? How do we rehumanize someone? And the answer to that is compassion. And when we're compassionate with someone, we hold a mirror up to them and allow them to see their humanity reflected back at them when they can't see it on their own. It's through compassion and radical compassion that we go from dehumanization to rehumanization. And that's where we get to the point where, as a society, it's very important that we learn to call people out in a healthy way. But it's with compassion that we learn to call people in at the same time. And when we can rehumanize, we can defuse that dehumanization and hatred.
Robert, do you want to say anything to that?
Yeah, well, I think when it comes to responses, I mean, there's quite a lot of, this can be a session itself to discuss prevention and responses to violent extremism or violent white supremacy. I think there are two things that primarily I want to stress. One is that most people who work with other people, be it teachers, social workers, mental health providers, they're good and equipped at working with change with other people. But most of those professionals usually take a step back when it comes to engaging with people who are involved in violent extremism, because they feel that they're not equipped for this. This is frightful, it's potentially violent. And my experience tells that if we equip professionals in how to understand and respond, they're usually quite good at also dealing with this specific target group. Understanding the dynamics of why people join, how people are affected and influenced and changed once they join these type of groups and ideas, and what we can do to create change. I think this is one of the benefits we see with the Karuna Brave School projects, to equip professionals, to equip teachers and school staff with how can we understand and respond in a way that doesn't lead to escalation, to shame, to confrontation, but instead de-escalate. Look at how we can create understanding and compassion and change. I also want to stress the importance of Karuna coming from the peace-building field. There's a range of practices within mediation, restorative justice, and similar fields that addresses dialogue, to understand the other person's perspective, to be able to come closer, and that way create change. I think there's a missed opportunity to not use this experience and practice more. Karuna is on the way, but I think others can also follow in this, to look at the practices and look at what can we learn from these experiences. Peace building and mediation in violent conflicts means dealing with parts that have potentially committed violence or are committed violence towards each other, and how do we work with that? These practices and lessons learned can also be adapted and adjusted here. And lastly, when it comes to exit work and helping people to leave, it might seem counterintuitive to engage with the target group with compassion. But if we truly want to help people to change, we usually don't do that by confronting them, by shaming them, by putting them in the corner. But instead, we engage in dialogue and we open up for opportunities to reflect and to grow. So what we focus a lot on when it comes to exit work, helping people to leave, is growth. Helping people to grow, to develop, to see new perspectives. And I would really advocate to have that mindset of growth instead of shame. We need people to take accountability for what they've done, but we also need compassion and to help them to get back into society.
I just want to quickly add, if shame is at the root of the problem, how can more shame possibly be the answer?
I want to just shift to Loretta, who's written and taught a lot on talking about the calling in as opposed to calling out. And we've all talked. The title of this is, you all knew of this session, was Radical Compassion, and you've talked about radical forgiveness. And it would be great to hear you talk a bit about that and how, in terms of the response to the issues and that we're talking about here, of how you practice that, how you teach that, and to just talk to us a bit about that.
Well, you probably can predict that I'm going to give a multi-layered answer because I never see a one way to do things. We have to fight the ideas of the hate movement. We just can't leave those unchallenged while we deal with, while we individualize the recruitment process and the deprogramming process, because they can always find more vulnerable people to pull in. So we have to make their ideas as obviously noxious as they are. And I think the best antidote to that is to teach people how by joining the human rights movement, they have a choice, they have a chance to become more than they ever could imagine that they could become. That's where you find your power. That's where you find recognition. That's where you find meaning in life. It's in the service to others that it really ends up serving yourself, kind of thing. So there's that. In terms of calling people in, the problem that I see with the call-out culture is that it's so baked into the DNA of our society, where people try to lift themselves up by putting other people down, whether that's done in religious organizations or in politics or in schools, or it is part of our culture. I mean, the original definition of call-out killed Alexander Hamilton in a duel, so you can't claim that it's just the internet. I mean, that was the original meaning of the word call-out. And so we are caught up in this moment, not that the call-out culture is new, but what is new is, like Tony said, the technology. You know, it's one thing for one person to try to shame you. It's another thing for that person to have the ability to get 10,000 other people to shame you, all around what they think you've done wrong and should be held accountable and stuff like that. And so at a social level, we have to address this shame culture that we're in, and do so on every level, because the media finds the shame business very profitable. You know, and you know, oh, I was talking to someone earlier tonight about how the absurd way we fund education in this culture contributes to that. Because even if you can find a school willing to bring in a panel like us and experts like us to help deal with these problems, within 2 hours, they're going to run out of their professional development budget. And so they want to do it, but they don't have the structure, the money, the staffing, all the things that are necessary to actually create that culture shift within the classrooms, you know, within their individual engagements with students. And so addressing it at the individual level and at the social level, excuse me, simultaneously is what I think is needed. And we have to take on, for example, I've been talking to a lot of people in Florida, and you know, Ron DeSantis is in the business of making white people feel bad about growth, about growing, about inclusion, about perfecting our democracy. He's in the business. He accuses us of making white people feel bad. He's doing a better job than any of us ever could, because he is basically saying, you are incapable of doing and being more than you presently are, and don't let anybody tell you different. And he is finding that a profitable and a politically powerful message to preach to people who are already insecure, who already, you know, are anti-elitist and all the things that have been inculcated, and then he can march all the way to the White House with that kind of message. And so we're up against a hell of a machine, operation, mindset, ideology, history. But I'll just say this, and shut up because I can talk. The good news is that we got the stuff that really matters on our side, because they think that they're fighting us. And in fact, I think they're wrong. We're fighting them, but they're not fighting us, because they're fighting truth, they're fighting time, and they're fighting history. And any of those forces are going to kick their asses. So when we have truth, time, history, and even evidence on our side, we have a winning hand. You know, though it may not feel like it at this moment, but I feel we're on the right side of history. We're on the right side of justice. And my biggest fear is that with our indulgence in the call-out culture, that we'll snatch defeat from the jaws of victory as we turn on each other instead of coming together so that we can defeat this fascist movement.
I really appreciate how you have articulated so well. All of you have, the work at multiple levels. And it's interesting, and you brought up dialogue, that Karuna's, has been the heart of what Karuna's peace-building work around the world for these decades. It is that work at multiple levels. You need to work at a community level, you need to work at an individual level, but as you said, you can't just leave the ideology aside. So it's a political, ideological level as well as a social level in all its complexity. So it's huge, and it is daunting. I think we all probably feel a bit daunted right now, but I want to open the floor to questions. If you have questions, Daniela has a microphone, so just, we're going to, even though we may be able to hear you, this is for the live stream so that everybody can hear. So if people have, Daniela, there's one question right over there. We will turn to over there. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm wondering if the story of how you, I'm not sure what word you use, escaped, got out, the two men, from the culture you were part of that gave you things, has enabled you to have the compassion you talk about, or how it informs how you talk to the people that you talk to who are still there in those groups.
I think that's yours, Tony.
So I just didn't quite catch the last part of that question.
No, I'm asking if the way out for either of you informs how you talk to the people that you're trying to get out. Because we didn't hear how you got out of the groups you were in. We heard how you got in.
Right. I'd say absolutely it does. And, in my book, over 1,000 hours of one-on-one and group counseling where I, with the help of a great therapist, mentor, and friend, unpacked how I made those decisions, why I made those decisions, and how I got out. And one of the things, the more I learned about myself and the more I could have compassion for myself, the more I could recognize the humanity in others. And the more I could recognize the humanity in others, the more I could recognize them in me. And got into this positive feedback loop, where I am you and you are me. We are all connected. But when I was in this movement, I experienced the world only through the ego, the mind's lens of disconnection and separateness. And so the more that I've worked with people, and I'll just say real quickly, the birth of my daughter and then my son 15 months later was the catalyst for my change. And at that point, I was such a narcissist and I had my head so far up my ego, was so self-absorbed. But for the very first time, I started to make decisions for someone other than myself. And I got to parent my kids the way that I always wanted to be parented, which was very cathartic. I ended up being a single father by the time they were 4 and 6, I was a single father. I needed my mom's help to raise them. My mom, who loved me unconditionally, her relationship with me was very conditional. And it was conditional on me not associating with the groups, me stopping the activity, and she leveraged that. And so that taught me a very important piece, and that's where compassion, when it's combined with healthy boundaries and consequences, is a very powerful thing. When it's just on its own and we're just, it can be perceived as weak. And if you just forgive people and allow them to continue doing what they're doing, that's not really what compassion and forgiveness is. So that piece, and the counselor that I met, I'll just try and be really quick here. I'd left the movement in 1998, but the movement hadn't left me. And by the time 2004 rolled around, I was still a jerk. I was still mean to people and all of those things, even though I wasn't involved in the group. And I started doing this personal development work and dealing with my ego and getting over limiting beliefs and such. And after about 8 months, I'd done all these courses with this guy. I was born in Liverpool. He was born in Manchester. He's about 10 years old, and we bonded over Monty Python and stuff like that. And my best friend comes up to me on my birthday and goes, "Yeah, I got a gift certificate for you." And I open it up and I pull it out, and it's a gift certificate for like a one-on-one therapy session. Like, great. Who doesn't want therapy for their birthday, right? Best gift ever. So I go in and see the guy and go through some small talk, and he's like, we're on the clock. You got an hour. You want to get into some stuff. And I told him I was angry at my mom and angry at my dad and all the things you do. And I stopped and I said, do I tell him the rest? And I was staring at the carpet and hoping the carpet is going to give me some sort of insight as to what's happening. And that piece of carpet didn't, so I look over at that one, and he's like, "Come on, mate, it's all right, just let it out. You look like you're trying to swallow 3 golf balls." And I was terrified to tell him about being a skinhead and Aryan Nations and all of that, Because when people had found out about who I had been, it was the end of the relationship. And this was a relationship I valued. And I didn't want to lose this relationship. And so I'm staring at the carpet again, and he's like, mate, we're on the clock here. And I think to myself, do I tell him? And I just said, what the hell? And in an act of extreme vulnerability, I blurted all out, and this is what I did. And I'm staring at the carpet while I do it, and I look up, and he's smiling at me. And the more I tell him, the more he's smiling. And the more he's smiling, the more I'm getting, like, annoyed. Like, here I am bearing my soul for the first time in this therapy session. This guy's laughing at me, and I'm like, what's so funny? And he leans in with a big Cheshire cat grin on his face, and he goes, you know I'm Jewish, right? Of course. You know, the irony of that. But here I am, like, I sit back in my chair, cheeks flushed in shame, and knowing that I'd once advocated for the annihilation of him and his people. And he said, that's what you did. That's not who you are. I see you. I see little Tony. And with that, I started sobbing and crying. And if that man could learn to love me, then certainly I could learn to love myself. And that began a journey of healing and counseling and running towards the wounds and the fear and everything that I'd been running away from my entire life. And that began the healing journey that has brought me here before you today.
Can I just add, before I would agree to this program, I had to check these guys out. Because so many people have conversions of convenience when the law is on their ass, when they're about to lose their marriage or their kids, or, you know, the FBI got a picture of them at January 6th, whatever it is. And so I don't come in automatically assuming the conversion story is true. And I find that the people who are most sincere in their conversions are the ones who've hit rock bottom in some kind of way, where they don't see any way out of this pit that they're in except trying something radically different. You know, one person I worked with, son was born with a cleft palate, and his Aryan Nation buddies told him that he was a genetic defect and needed to be put to death. Bing! These are the people I've been hanging out with for 20 years, threatening to kill my child, kind of. So those are the stories that are most believable for me, the rock bottom stories, not the, oh, I've just suddenly decided I like black people stories. They're not convincing. And then even then, they're still, just because they left a hate group, they haven't necessarily, like Tony said, left hate. And so another person I had to work on their deprogramming, one of the first things we had them do was testify in Montana in support of a gay rights bill. Because even though they had renounced hate, did it go to extend to the LGBT community? You know, and I watched him choke, but he testified. This was his first time, you know, confronting those pockets of hate that he had not divulged himself of. He hadn't divested from them yet. And so it's a process. It's not an epiphany. It's an entire process because it takes some years to get into the movement, and it takes some years. It might take, and by the way, how did you quit without your buddies trying to kill you? Because that's also part of the other thing. They know you're leaving with a lot of knowledge that can be damaging to them. So it's not like leaving the Kiwanis Club. How do you provide for your security or protection when you choose to leave these groups? I'd be interested in knowing as well.
Just to quickly answer that, when I left, I didn't denounce anybody. I left with my beliefs intact. And I left, the way I justified it to myself is, you know, why should I fight for a bunch of white people who couldn't give a damn whether I lived or died? If I really care for the white race, I'm going to take care of these two children and make sure they thrive and survive. That's how I transitioned out without giving up my identity. Once I left behind, the identity piece began to weaken as I became a single father, and that became a new identity. I was able to let that go, but it was 12 years after I left before I did a television interview or publicly denounced anything that I was in, and by then those people weren't around anymore.
Robert, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I have much to add. I'm not sure where to start, but which is very, very briefly on so the question on why my also disengagement was linked to getting the glasses in 9th grade and starting to read a lot of ideology, and over the years really getting a grip of what is the content of the ideology, and then observing the people I had around me. And at that point, at least in the Swedish movement, I think quite a lot in the American movement as well, there's a bit of a discrepancy between we talk about elitism, but we don't really live as elitist. So meaning there's a lot of talk about purity in body and mind, but you drink 5 days a week, you smoke, don't eat healthy, you don't work out, you're not really oriented on the ideology, but you say a lot of things. So for me, this discrepancy that I saw within the movement started a doubt of, is this really where I want to engage and put my energy and commitment? So this was really part of the disengagement. And I was very committed to do military service to prepare and get trained for the coming revolution, inspired by the groups we talked about earlier, the American groups, the Order in the 80s and such. So the military and this process of kind of distancing myself from the comrades, but not really ideology, joining the military really helped to cut the bonds with the group. And parallelly, one of the things that drove me into the movement was the search for self-esteem. And by joining the military and being at least a fairly good and competent soldier, I could build up self-esteem outside of the movement, outside of the extremism. And for me, this very clearly made a cut that I don't really need the movement to develop and grow and be who I am. So for me, this helped to distance and to leave. And as Tony says, it's not that I woke up one day and I was reformed and a fanatical Democrat, but it took a while to sort out the ideas. One of the most powerful things here was to meet people who I thought I didn't like, and realizing that I actually like them. And surprisingly, they like me. And this type of meetings was, I think, very powerful for my change and my transformation as well. And on the formers, working in this space for 25 years, I think formers can have a very important role when it comes to messaging and sharing experiences. But as Loretta said, I mean, we have to be able to vet authenticity. You know, how genuine is this commitment or this, which is difficult. How do we do this? And equally, formers might not always be the best to be role models for others, depending on how far they've come. I think this is not unique to violent extremism. I think this relates probably to other fields of self-help or peer support as well. So I think that there's a need for some type of quality standards here, but that is another discussion that I'd be happy to go into at some other point.
Sometimes being a drug addict doesn't automatically qualify you to be a drug counselor.
Right. We're running out of time, but is there any other questions that people have? Right over here.
I know, Loretta, that you write about this, but there was a recent article by a black gentleman named Maurice Mitchell who talks about sort of the way in which the progressive folks are also cannibalizing their own, and the sense of the way that shame is used. People feel hesitant to kind of embrace kind of others from other, you know, and I'm just kind of curious about how progressives and folks who kind of fall into these kind of same traps and how that perpetuates things as well.
Okay. I guess I want to address it also at the ideological level and then the practical one. One of the critiques I offer is of the kith and kin system, because that's the basis for white supremacy. I should only care about people I know and people who know me. And that is such an impoverished way of being in the world, because you should care about someone starving in Yemen if you never meet a Yemeni and they never know you. It's such a hard and difficult way and isolating way to build relationships with the rest of humanity. So I start by challenging the kith and kin system, because people don't realize how that operates on a personal level. You'll accept a mistake by a friend that you won't accept from a stranger. You'll forgive a friend for not knowing the right word, but then you'll go on and blast a stranger for doing the exact same thing. So we've got to get out of that defining of ourselves based on only our relationships with who knows us and who we know. On a practical level, I find that most people really don't want to be as cruel and destructive as their behavior can make them be. So instead of challenging them, which goes to the shame question that Tony asked, I inquire. Is what you're saying, how does what you're saying now line up with the good person that I'm sure you are? What are you doing that reflects that inner good person versus what I'm seeing right now? I don't call out their contradiction, I ask them to self-examine it. I often, though, also find very useful, particularly if I'm talking to people to the right of me in the political spectrum, I avoid dealing with their words and go underneath their words and talk about their values. And we find common ground in our values. You know, whereas I might ask, you know, do you care if people are hungry in this country as you're railing against welfare and, you know, the takers and the makers? Do you care if people are hungry? And if they say yes, I said, well, my work asks why they're hungry. Where you made me feel compelled to just start a food line and feed them. But we're doing the same work, just at different aspects of it. So when you can go underneath their words, stop your visceral reaction, your automatic reflex because they used the wrong word or got the gender pronoun wrong or whatever. Stop your reaction and pay loving, compassionate attention to them and recognize their humanity. Generally, you can talk to anybody except an intentional asshole. Because when they're doing it on purpose, I've got a different strategy. But that is not the majority of humanity.
I just wanted to follow up briefly with something I wanted to ask. And we'll do one more question, but about, we sort of hear a lot about people, you know, basically in trying to curtail violent behavior or, you know, racism, or how the response to the problem can often further inflame it. I mean, whether it was a swastika put on a school bathroom here in Northampton High School, and then, you know, there's this giant reaction. I mean, you were talking about the training today a bit, but how the reaction, you know, if you don't approach it in a way that can be heard, you're just gonna further reinforce the defensive kind of mode of responding. Could you talk any more a little bit about that, about how you respond effectively? You know, here we are personally, whether it's meeting people, behavior, et cetera, but how, and I think, you know, it can happen in a more progressive liberal community like this area that's, you know, we've certainly heard reports about the reactions, whether in schools or otherwise, further exacerbating the problem, to restate what I'm saying. So thoughts, I mean, you've all been speaking to it a bit, but thoughts particularly to that.
I'll just paraphrase one of the co-founders of Life After Hate, Frankie Mink. He says, you know, in all those times I went to rallies and people were throwing rocks and water bottles at my head, I never once thought, wow, maybe I should really change my belief system. Not once. And so it just doesn't work, right? So have I been punched out and beaten because of who I was? Sure. It just emboldened me. It just, you know, drove it further. And that doesn't mean that we don't have a physical presence to confront these people. It's just, you know, to what degree. And I was at it was right after Charlottesville. I was actually at Boston Common, and there was a small neo-Nazi rally, and there was 30,000 people showed up at Boston Common and said, "Mm-mm, not here, not today." There wasn't violence, but there was a very, very powerful message. And those people had to scurry away and with police protection and to go away. It was a very powerful yet peaceful message that sent a very, very clear message that might have been lost if those people had just been pummeled.
I think it is time, but we could go on and on. Any last thoughts?
If you don't mind me doing a small commercial.
Go for it, Loretta.
I teach calling in techniques online, and our next class starts March 28th, and it is a 4-part lecture series for $5 a lecture, so the whole package is $20. We call it, the $5 consciousness raising. And so you can go to my website, lorettaross.com, and find out about it and register for it. If you miss a class, you can get a copy of the tape of it, that kind of thing. But I'm really trying to create a call-in culture for the human rights movement, and so that's why we offer these online classes. They started with COVID, but they are very popular, and I like Zoom because we can do them nationally and internationally to learn calling in techniques, because we all know how to call people out, but it's hard because no one's taught us actually how to call people in.
Thank you, because that's what I sort of had wanted to end, but I feel like of what people can do, and I want to sign up for one of your courses. I think it is. It's all very personally. It can be very difficult of how you deal with, whether it's the uncle or the whoever, of how you try to more effectively deal with people just on a personal level. So anyways, thank you. Tony, Robert, last thoughts?
I was going to say thank you very much, Loretta, for what you've shared tonight. I've learned an awful lot in this conversation, as in previous conversations, so keep up the good work. And
Same to you.
And I just want to say it starts with us. Right? That's a good organization. Starts with us, and it's who we choose to be in every moment of every day. As human beings, we have the magnificent power to inspire others, for better, for worse. And so it's who we choose to be in every moment of every day, in every interaction with another human being. And are we going to choose fear and disconnection, or are we going to choose love and compassion and connection? And you have to make the difference. We have to make the difference. I'll just say it starts with us.
And let me also thank Karuna for arranging this event. Fantastic to be here. Thanks, Loretta and Tony, for being fantastic panel here. I'm honored to be here together with you. And as last words, echoing what we just heard, acknowledging the importance of humanizing the dehumanizers. So let's not go into the same type of lens that they do when they dehumanize other people, but to rehumanize and to think of dialogue. How do we create change? We know quite a lot about this. We know what works in terms of dialogue and change making and throwing a rock at somebody at the demonstration. That probably won't make them change their minds, but there's much more better ways in the spirit of Karuna's work. So thank you so much.
Thank you. And on behalf of Karuna, I want to thank the three of you. This has been a fabulous conversation, and we could have spent hours. And it is really interesting for thinking of Karuna's future work. We're doing this first project here with you all because there's such a through line of the work. Whether you're working in Bosnia or Ethiopia or Nigeria or in Mississippi. Yeah, very different context, but at the heart of what needs to happen, it's a lot of the same work. So I'm hoping we will be able to do more here in the U.S. So thank you all for being here, for joining us, and for you all here in person, and those of you who have joined us via live stream. I appreciate your being here and your interest. So thank you all.
Oh, thank you. I enjoy reading this. I haven't yet written my book on my hate group work. I want to get to
Great.
that.
Fantastic.
Thank you.